Uh, I'm back again. This is my book review of The Civil Wars by Appian of Alexandria, Part 2. If you haven't seen the first video, you should probably watch the first video first. But yeah, what happened is I got cut off at 30 minutes because the camera automatically does that. And sorry, I don't know anything about YouTube editing, so I don't know how to put these two into two different videos, but I decided to make a separate video because I had more to say, and I know it's self-indulgent to kind of talk, ramble, let's be honest, ramble this long about a book, but why not, huh? Why not be self-indulgent every once in a while? I'm going to kind of do some more rambling. If it's interesting or useful to somebody, they can watch it. If it's not interesting or useful, you can ignore it. I guess we'll kind of, see how much value comes out of this. In the previous video, I was kind of giving a broad overview of my thoughts on this book. In this video, I'm going to pick up right where I left off at the tail end, was beginning to get into kind of what I thought were the more interesting parts of the book, kind of going chronologically through, kind of summarizing what happens and giving my opinions. Now, I hate to say this, but I may well find that I get to the end of this second video and I still haven't covered everything that's of interest in this book. But in that case, I think I really am going to stop after 2 videos. So I'm going to ramble some more, and anything I don't cover at the end of this video, I just won't cover. And I mean it this time. The last video, I was kind of starting right at the very beginning of the book, which was with the Gronke Brothers. And I was making the point that the Gronke Brothers have been kind of politicized by modern Marxist historians, or there's that accusation that's made. But I think if you go back to the ancient sources, the Gronke Brothers were already politicized. They come pre-packaged, politicized, if it were. I think Plutarch and the rest of the ancient writers who wrote about the Gronke Brothers wrote about them in very sympathetic terms. They were kind of the idealists standing up to like kind of the corrupt aristocracy. And what's notable about Appian is Appian doesn't give that view, or sorry, he gives that view, but Appian gives both sides of the land reform controversy. And I was reading somewhere online, Wikipedia or somewhere, I don't remember, that Appian is the only ancient writer we have who actually gives both sides. All the other writers are kind of sympathetic exclusively to the Gronke brothers. Grachi or Graki, I don't know. Appian is the only one that tries to kind of give some balance and say, no, look, the other side had a point. I should give some background here because I shouldn't assume everybody knows what I'm talking about. Although usually I kind of assume most people know what I'm talking about. I guess I'm assuming that if you clicked on the video that said a book review of The Civil Wars by Appian of Alexandria, you've got some sort of interest in the subject material, maybe some background. So I am assuming that somewhat, but let me just kind of give some background on this controversy as I understand it. And I'm not an expert. I'm just like, you know, some guy who's read this book. So if I'm getting anything wrong on anything, feel free to correct me in the comments. But this is my understanding. So around the time of the Gronke Brothers, there was a problem. Rome had acquired a lot of land through conquests. And they decided to kind of divide this land up among its citizens. Now, Rome had a vested interest in keeping a strong middle class full of like middle class farmers for a couple reasons. I guess kind of one, like a strong middle class is like the backbone of every economy. But two, like in the days of the Republic, you needed a property qualification to get into the army. Like they didn't want it to be a slaves' army. they wanted it to be a citizens' army because, you know, citizens have a vested interest in fighting for their country. Kind of slaves, or I guess the poor people, do not, or at least that's the perception. I think we probably, you know, call that a prejudice nowadays. The idea that poor people can't be as patriotic as middle-class people. So that's one reason they kind of needed a strong middle class, is because their army depended on it. But like another reason is just, you know, having a lot of poor citizens just causes all sorts of problems. They flood into the city. There's kind of crime and mob violence and stuff like that, which was beginning to happen at around this period. Now, the problem with this land was it was originally supposed to be distributed to all the citizens, but nobody had really kind of taken care to make sure this happened. So because the conquest had happened rapidly, they just kind of opened up the land to anyone who was willing to work on it. The rich people had acquired a lot of land, and Appian says either through force or kind of through persuasion or both, they were able to kind of increase their land holdings and kind of take the land from the poorer farmers. And then the rich people didn't want freedmen to work on their land because, you know, freedmen, you have to pay them money and it costs trouble. So they just brought in a lot of slaves. So you had like, not only, it's like a double whammy. Not only are kind of the freedmen, the kind of Roman middle-class farmers, not getting kind of wiped out, but now you have all these slaves. And Appian even mentions a recent slave revolt that happened in Sicily. I think slave revolts kind of happened all the time in the ancient world. This was a consideration when you had kind of too much slaves and kind of too few citizens. You've got an unstable government. So the Gronke brothers, the first one, Tiberius Gracchus, realizes that this is an unstable situation. Actually, sorry, which one was first? I always get them mixed up. Was Tiberius first or was Gaius first? Sorry, excuse me 1 minute. So it was... Sorry, I was hoping this would jump out at me earlier, but they just keep saying Gracchus, 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 Gracchus in the text. It doesn't like say which, you know, they don't use their full names until like the very beginning. Sorry, this video isn't as well prepared as it could have been. The older Gracchus brother thinks this is going to be perfectly reasonable. You just present this bill to the Senate. You say it's in everybody's best interest that we redistribute this land to the Roman citizens, the poorer people. And he was not talking about like a radical land redistribution like Stalin or something like that. Your private land holdings you could keep. He was only talking about the public land. So only this land that had been declared kind of public after the conquest. And he assumed kind of everyone would say, okay, I'm going to have to make some level of self-sacrifice here if I'm rich, but it's for the public good, so I'll just kind of go along with it. But what caught him by surprise is, in fact, nobody was willing to make concessions on this. There were a number of rich, powerful people with vested interests in keeping their own land. And they were powerful politically. He doesn't say it outright, but you definitely get the impression that the senators and kind of the rich landowners were overlapping. Like a lot of the senators were rich landowners. And again, what's noticeable about Appian, which is not in the other ancient sources, is Appian kind of goes through the reasons that the rich people thought they should be able to hang on to this land. Some of them had taken out loans to buy this land. You know, they had bought it illegally because according to the law they weren't supposed to. But they had bought it and they had taken out loans. Once they had it, they'd made improvements on that property. Some of them had family buried on that property. Some of them had, that property was part of their daughter's dowry, or was received as part of a daughter's dowry or something. So they felt like they had investments in this land, and they just didn't want to give it up. And I thought, boy, this is like every political issue ever. I mean, it's like looking into an ancient mirror, isn't it? Because you think of like, there's a million examples, but the most obvious one is climate change, where you're like, okay, look, we all breathe the same air, we're all living on the same planet Earth. This is in everybody's best interest to clear this problem up. So let's just everybody sacrifice a little bit and let's get this politics going, and we're going to solve this global warming. And yet it does not get solved because certain people have interests in it, private interests, and they are not going to budge for the public good. Hopefully I'm not rambling too much, but another comparison which kind of springs to mind is the American Civil War. So, in America, we fought a war over the slavery question. Now, if you kind of read some of the literature leading up to the Civil War, both in America and kind of in Europe, I picked this up a few years ago. I was reading a biography on Marx. Marx and his buddies, I think, had kind of a debate going on about whether slavery in America could be settled with or without a civil war. Now, in order for slavery to be settled without a civil war, the slave owners would have had to say, okay, you got us, we didn't want to give up the slaves, but it's a democratic country, Lincoln got elected legally, I guess we have to abide by the laws and kind of give up our wealth. Now, I know Lincoln never outlawed slavery in the southern states or promised to, but that's the analogy that they would have been willing to give up their slaves because of the democratic process, or because, they're making concessions to the common good. But what happened, as we know from history, is they would not give up their wealth. Once they had that vast amount of wealth amassed, it did not matter what was for the good of the country, or, putting aside even the obvious moral question about slavery, they would not voluntarily give up their wealth. And I think Marx and his buddies said, this is the capitalist problem. The capitalists will never voluntarily give up their wealth through a democratic election. Sorry, I got sidetracked there into kind of Marxist politics, talking about the Gronke Brothers. The idea is, it's so obvious that this is for the common good, but the landowners are just obstinate and say, no, we've got this, we're hanging on to this, and you can't get any sort of compromise here. And then Appian makes another observation, which I thought was so like nowadays. Appian says, okay, now, once the positions had been drawn on both sides, kind of the pro-land reform and the anti-land reform, then he said a spirit of rivalry set in, where it was no longer even about the issues, but they just kind of looked at this as like a competition between each other and a way of kind of scoring points. Like if the pro-land reform gets kind of a bill passed through, then they kind of cheer on the victory and kind of laugh on the other side. If the anti-land reform is able to kind of hinder the bill or the reforms, they kind of look at that as a victory and they celebrate and kind of mock the other side. And then Appian says, well, now any spirit of compromise is over, because now it's a competition. And I thought, that is American politics today, isn't it? I mean, any global warming or gun control or health insurance or just any of these issues, any sensible compromise or any cool-headed way of looking at what's obviously in the nation's best interest or sorry, I shouldn't use the word obviously, any discussion of what could be in the nation's best interest, because it's not always obvious, is just out the window. Nobody wants to do it. Everyone just thinks of politics as a game. Like, we won, you guys lose, or we won, you guys lose. It was just amazing reading this and thinking, wow, human nature just never changes. Like, the politics of Republican Rome are like exactly the politics of America. Now, what's scary, if you want to get scared about this, is Appian is looking at the end of Republican Rome. Kind of, he's setting this out and he's saying, okay, this is the beginning of the end here. Like, this is when things started to get bad and led to a lot of bloodshed, and then 100 years later we get Caesar. I don't know, you could make the case that this is kind of a whitewashed view of history. Like, the Romans kind of saw the period of civil violence beginning with the Gronke Brothers. Perhaps they saw that because they had just forgotten to write about all the other tumultuous periods in the previous 500 years. Maybe republics are always like that. Maybe we're always just kind of bickering with each other and viewing it factionally. I think, like, if you go back and read about the presidential elections in the 1790s, already there's like dirty politics and stuff going on. I don't know. So the Gronke Brothers kind of ends in disaster, like, as you know, if you know your Roman history. And then there are kind of several other kind of reformers who kind of spring up after that. Saturnius, I think I'm pronouncing his name right. And then Marcus Livius Drusus, who wanted citizenship for the Italian allies. The Italian allies is also an interesting question here, because to a certain extent, both the Italian allies and the Roman plebeians are getting the bad end of the stick here. Like, they're both getting screwed over by the Roman aristocracy. They should be natural allies, but they're not always, because the Roman plebeians can say to themselves, hey, at least we're citizens. You know, we may be low, but we're not as low as the Italians. We're one step above the Italians. Now, if you make the Italians citizens, then the Roman plebeians feel like they're losing out, because now there's no one below them. So the Roman plebeians are actually against the efforts of reformers to make the Italians citizens, which I thought, maybe this is stretching things a little bit, but I thought that is kind of similar to the way in American politics, historically, politicians have kind of kept the poor white people from allying with the black people in the South, even though they would have like a lot of common interests. The poor white people said, well, we might be poor, but at least we're not black. And that kind of kept the kind of racial politics in the American South. It seemed like a parallel here. This leads into the social war. Now, the social war is when the Italian allies just get sick of it and say, okay, fine, you're not going to make us citizens, we're going to war. We helped you build this empire, we deserve a share in it. I think the causes of the social war are very interesting, like what I've just been talking about. As I said in the first video, though, the actual war, like the actual military history behind the war, I am less interested in. And I think here's where Appian drops the ball a little bit, because when we get to the actual campaigns in the Italian social war, it's like, okay, this army went here and took this town, and then this army went here and took this town, and this guy went here and took this town, and this guy went here and took this town. And I even thought, if I was writing this, as I was reading this, I thought, do I really need to know this? I mean, like, in general, I'm glad about all the surviving information we have from ancient Rome. And, you know, like, I wish that all those lost books of Livy and all those lost books of Appian had survived, and, you know, grateful for what information did survive. But I thought, you know, if these sections got lost to history and we didn't know which towns, which generals marched to which towns, would it have been a great loss? we maybe could have lost this section and been none the lesser. I don't know. I'm being a little bit harsh here. But that was kind of, up until that point, I kind of thought, wow, Appian is like the greatest historian ever. I can't believe he's not more famous than he is, right? Because he's not that famous. Like, everybody knows Livy, everybody knows Tacitus, everybody knows Herodotus. Not many people have heard of Appian. And up until that point, I was like, oh, wow, Appian is really great. But then it did kind of get a little bit boring here. And it does get boring in sections. I already mentioned that in my first video. I'm not going to belabor the point. Skipping over the boring parts, I guess, and talking about when it gets interesting again. Their Roman politics becomes very factionalized. There's a section of populist reformers who I believe in Latin are called populares, although I don't think Appian ever uses that term, at least not in the translation I was reading. But they're kind of the populist reformers. And then there's the aristocratic section, of the conservatives. I think, again, the Latin term was optimates, although I don't think Appian uses that. And they kind of coalesce around two individuals who are vying for power and glory, Marius on one side and Sulla on the other side. And it's kind of, at this point, it's maybe less about the original politics of it and kind of more about personal glory. But then there's the civil wars between Marius and Sulla, where kind of Sulla marches on Rome, Marius flees, Sulla goes off to fight the war of Mithridates, and then Marius comes back and takes the city of Rome and just butchers his enemies. And this was like, this was like a big deal because, like, again, as Appian says in his introduction, kind of before this period, Romans were not butchering each other. There were no civil wars in Rome. And now he's like, Marius is taking the city as if it were an enemy city and kind of butchering his own political opponents. And then Sulla comes back. Marius is dead by this time. Sulla comes back and takes the city. Now, what Sulla did was a little bit different than Marius. Marius kind of conducted these massacres of his political opponents, where soldiers kind of run through the street and kind of, kill everyone Marius didn't like. But it was not methodical. Sulla actually draws up a long list of everyone who he wants killed. And it's a long list. He's got a lot of names of people he wants killed. And there's reward money for killing these people or informing on them. And there's also punishments for hiding these people. Now, if you read ancient history, it's always bloody. There are always massacres going on. There's always people getting killed. It's easy to kind of get desensitized to this. But Appian has a point he wants to make about these proscriptions. Appian says, look, I know everybody was always killing everybody, but he says, this is different. Never before in Roman history, maybe in all of ancient history, I don't know, but Appian definitely says never before in Roman history did anyone make lists. Like, there were never lists kind of nailed to the forum wall. What Marius did was terrible, but Marius did all his massacres in hot blood, in the heat of the moment, kind of while his army was running through the streets. Sulla, this is after Sulla is in control, after everything has calmed down, and he's still got this death list where the soldiers are kind of going from house to house searching for people on this death list. And Appian says this has never happened before. And you read this section, and it strikes... Let me make a comparison here. The Gronke Brothers, the politics behind the Gronke Brothers, struck me as very modern in a sense because it's similar to the factional politics in America today. This section also struck me as very modern, but in a completely different way and kind of in a much worse way. This struck me as kind of similar to the death police of Stalin or Mao or Hitler, or kind of the dictators of the 20th century, where you know, again, history has always been very bloody, but these kind of methodical lists in secret police that you have under Stalin, I think, are unique. I mean, not unique in the case that they're one of a kind, but unique in the case that they are rare. And you've got a parallel to this in Appian with Sulla. And Appian, really, the proscriptions are a big part of Appian's history. He wants the reader to know just how terrible this is. And he does this by going through a lot of case histories. And he says right at the beginning, he says, there were hundreds of people killed by these proscriptions, and I do not have the space to go through them all, he says. But I'm going to give you a list of a lot of examples just to kind of let you know what was going on. And he goes through all these cases of this person tried to get away, but he got caught. And this person tried to get away, and he got caught. And this person tried to get away, and he got caught. And it's really quite depressing after you read it for quite a long time. Now, I can be quite naive, I guess. I kind of, before reading this, I maybe had a child's view of ancient history. And I thought, okay, well, this is before border controls and drone cameras and the surveillance state. If your name is on a proscription list, you can just run into the woods and nobody can ever find you. I mean, you know, they don't have any photographs of you. This is 2,000 years ago. And to a certain extent, that's true, and some people got away with that. And Appian does give a few cases of people who got away. But this is something I guess I never realized before. How reliant people are on society. And especially like the people who are on these prescription lists are, for the most part, kind of well-to-do people. They're politically connected. That's why they got proscribed in the first place. So they're not used to kind of living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So some of them do actually run into the woods and then kind of start starving after 3 days and then have to come back. And some of them do kind of run off and then just, you know, I guess in the ancient world you just couldn't be running around unprotected by yourself. They just get picked up by bandits and sold into slavery. So they really just, they're really screwed over here. They can't just kind of run off. They've got to stay in civilization to survive. But everywhere they go in civilization, people are looking for them because the reward is a lot of money, apparently. I forget how much it was, but it must have been a lot of money because everybody wants this reward money. And you can get killed for like protecting them or hiding them. So people are scared to help them, and a lot of these people just kind of run from place to place to place trying to get away or trying to get help, and then just get caught by the soldiers. And Appian does a very good job of creating an atmosphere because he lists like so many stories of people trying to get away but couldn't get away. And the cumulative effect on these stories on the reader is you start to get like a claustrophobic feeling. You start to get the feeling like, yeah, boy, there really was no escape from this. You know, you're on that list. It's just a matter of time before they get you. He does actually give a couple cases of people who did get away. But you know, most of them did not. So that's a feeling of like a Stalinist police state way back in ancient Rome 2,000 years ago. So it's another thing where it's modern, and it's not modern in a good way. But it's a modern in the sense of, you know, like 20th century totalitarian police states. Now, the proscriptions, Sulla was the first one to do this, but they actually happened twice. I'm gonna break chronology here and go to the next time it happened. Now, both times, this is one of Appian's major themes, and he really hits this hard because he wants the reader to know it. The second time it happens is with the second triumvirate. And Appian says, okay, the first time was Sulla, but nobody cares about Sulla. This is Mark Antony and Octavian and Oedipus, and Octavian is the one who founded the empire. So this is like, this leads into directly to the foundation of the government we have now. I'm out of time. Thank you very much for listening. I'm just going to leave it here.